group of about 8-9 people here in 408 Hayes Hall. So we have a group that has been coming in each week to meet in person, and certainly great to have the rest of you on Zoom. So I think we have the system set up that it works reasonably well to have in person and online work. We now have, thanks to our owl, I think it's been working quite well. And if it isn't for those of you online, we would love to hear back from you in terms of whether it's working for you or not. Just in case we need to move things around a little bit. But as far as I know, it's been working reasonably well for people to see what's going on in the in-person group, and allows everyone to stay maybe a little better connected than we have been over the last couple of years. So as you all know, we try to start about 12:05, and we take the first couple of minutes to open things up for updates, comments, questions that anyone has about things that are upcoming and things that are going on now and things that we're thinking about for the future. So I have a couple items, but I'd like to open it up to everyone now. Anyone in the room here? Not even from the USDA?
No updates.
No updates yet.
Well, one thing I would mention, so I got back from a meeting last night, actually, from out in Bozeman, Montana. Was the meeting of the Association for the Advancement of Industrial Crops. And there was some excellent talks, excellent science. And I bet almost 50% of those were either on or related to camelina. So there's a hell of a lot of interest in camelina right now, all over, even in Europe, not just the United States. And there were several talks on pennycress too. So we held up our end there. Thought I mentioned that. Yep.
So who are the major players from your standpoint? Who are the major players in the US outside of the activities we have here and you guys have at Morris? Who are the major players in the Midwest?
Well, there's not much else in the Midwest other than us.
Yeah.
If you're talking about people working on pennycress, a lot of them are out in the West, western part of the US, and most of that's with spring camelina, not as much with winter camelina. Yeah. Sustainable oils, they're starting to play a big role. Smarter Seed was there at the meeting too. Of course, they're up in Canada. But,
yeah. Just, did you have a comment?
I was going to mention that I don't know if we mentioned this before, but Mitch has been involved in this as well. We're toward COP27, the big climate meetings. We were invited to write a blog post, and I actually got accepted to be part of the UMN delegation. So I'll be there.
Cool.
And I'm kind of teeing up, engaging with this national, international natural climate solutions group that has become really engaged and interested in perennial and continuous living cover systems. So
yeah, it's great you're there.
Yeah, so that'll be exciting, and it sounds like as I've started engaging with the community toward this meeting, it sounds like this will kind of be an exciting year. It's in Africa where they're starting to plant perennial rice.
Yeah, right.
And it sounds like in that community, like this is gonna be a first year of teeing up a few years of really starting to promote these climate solutions.
Yeah.
So on this global negotiations around climate change.
So is the African rice coming from Dr. Who's program in Kunming?
Yeah. And I just this morning learned that it is planted in Africa. So I have a lot of reading sitting in my email to do. But
so a lot of you know that we had that entire team here about 8 years ago, 7 years ago. So maybe we ought to invite Doctor Who, he was basically got the program started with funding from the Land Institute a number of years ago. So there's a strong working relationship through the Land Institute. And when I traveled to China, that he was the lead host for us to travel around China and basically highlighting the work on perennial rice. So it's interesting that it's moving to other regions, of the world as well. So
Yeah, and if there's like on any of that cropping systems, like feel free to feed me, like what's the latest status of them?
Yeah.
I mean, I know Kern's up, but
yeah. So I have one other reminder. There's been a call for proposals that's out, and I think the deadline is what, the 30th?
Correct, 30th, yeah.
So the 30th of this month, so it's a fast turnaround. And hope that you'll look at the RFP, and if you have ideas and situation that matches that RFP, this is one-shot funding from LCCMR, so it's a little different than what we've had in the past. And basically, what the call for proposals suggests is that this money, first off, the priority would be to make sure that we fill gaps in terms of personnel, or being able to follow through on the research and other things that need that continued support for a period of time. And I think the funds can be used up until 2024.
2025.
2025.
Yeah.
So in other words, in terms of bridge money for individuals and parts of a program that need to be extended, and then reminding you that there's very high chance that there'll be 2 calls for proposals again in July 1 of 2023, based on additional funds. So these are the 3 packages that we presented to you, I think, in the last conversation about potential funding.
The only thing I'll add to that is just based on a question I got. The funds are coming from LCCMR, but we are running an RFP that will look very similar to all the previous Forever Green RFPs. It's not an LCCMR type application. It's a Forever Green RFP type application. And if you, for instance, have gotten a ton of money from LCCMR and feel like, maybe I've, dipped into that pot too much, I don't think that applies in this situation at all, because we're making all the decisions internally. So I just wanted to clarify that for the group.
With approval from LCCMR.
Yes, they will approve the final
Yeah.
allocations, but they basically delegated the RFP process.
It's being managed in the same way the invasive species centers operate with LCCMR funds. Right. So with that, if there aren't any other comments and other input, why don't we move forward and ask Russ, Gesch, and his team to give an update on the work around the incorporation of pennycress and camelina in the agronomic systems, and what other issues that Russ and his team would like to put on the table today. So it's all yours, Russ.
All right, thanks, Don. Yeah, hopefully you keep this somewhat of a more of a discussion, perhaps. Let's see if I can share my slides first. Can you see them yet?
Yeah. Go full screen.
Yeah, I'm trying. There we go. Did it go? Did it go
No,
to?
see your speaker notes.
What's that?
See your speaker notes. We don't see the slides.
Oh,
Common issue.
Sometimes it helps to put it in presenter mode and then share your screen. It's like
presenter mode.
unshare.
Unshare.
Yeah, you could try that. That worked for me last week. Like stop sharing. Yep.
And then do what? Oh, wait. Carrie's here. She'll help.
Thanks, Carrie.
I'll see if I can figure it out for him.
So yeah, I threw together some slides here quickly to to just kind of give an update on some of the agronomic work we're doing, some of the more recent stuff with pennycress, and then there's some older stuff too, but
Does that work?
Yes.
is that better? Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Good we have somebody around here who's technically savvy, because it certainly ain't me. But yeah, so some of the update I'll be giving is on a project that Samantha and I, and of course there's a few others you can see as co-authors here that are involved in this project. It's a part of the I Prefer project, which is a NEFA cap grant for pennycress. I think most people in our group are familiar with that. And one of the main thrusts here is that, you know, we've been working a lot on how to establish pennycress either in or after corn. Corn gets to be a bugger to try to establish almost any cover crop, but our winter oil seeds as well. And of course, we always tout them as being a cash cover crop between corn and soybean, with, you know, trying to double crop, either relay crop or sequentially double crop soybean after the or with pennycress. So I think most everybody here is familiar with pennycress, so I don't have to spend much time on this, but I do want to point out that, you know, now with the work that David Marks and others have done, we have improved varieties, minus some of the weedy traits, like we have better shatter resistance now. We also have pennycress that has both an edible oil profile and non-edible. Most pennycress, especially wild pennycress, the oil is non-edible. It's high in erucic acid, high in glucosinolates. So even with the edible forms that are available now, or accessions that are available, the primary interest is still in the industrial uses of the oil, particularly biofuels. Aviation fuel is a biggie. There's a lot of people working on this, and then and bioproducts as well. As you know, we have good relationship, good collaboration with PepsiCo, and I think it's a sister company of theirs, Danico. Is that right? They're working on using pennycress oil for developing bioplastics. So that's where a lot of the interest lies. And a lot of these companies, a lot of people that we're collaborating with, and you've heard me talk about this before with winter camelina, but, you know, and not to step on anybody's toes here, but pennycress oil is not all that exciting. I mean, there's nothing real special about it, but what these companies, what industry is interested in, what these companies are interested in, is how they fit into cropping systems. You know, that we're fitting them in as a cover crop, cash cover crop between corn and soybean, and other summer annual crops in general in the upper Midwest. And just like winter camelina, pennycress has a really good ability to scavenge excess nitrogen, particularly in the spring. It does scavenge some in the fall, but as most of you know, it doesn't put on a lot of growth in the fall. But it does in the spring, and that's where it really shines in terms of picking up excess nitrogen. In this graph that's on the left side, that's nitrate nitrogen that we've collected from water samples that were collected from suction cup lysimeters, and just showing that so pennycress is able to keep that nitrogen out of the soil water, where it can leach or get into runoff and become a pollutant. And it does use that nitrogen for growth and so on. And then the pictures on the right, I mean, a picture says 1,000 words or more, actually, in this case. But as you can see, the pictures on the right, it's pretty obvious. The lower right there, those two pictures, those were plots that were pretty close to each other. The one on the right, you can see, you know, where there's some soil movement from water erosion of the soil there, and where you keep the soil covered with pennycress. Does a great job of keeping that soil in place. And that's shown, you know, you guys have seen these pictures before, the runoff that we've collected, runoff samples. And this was after a heavy rain in the spring, when the business as usual was still fallow, still nothing really growing there. And pennycress and winter camelina do a very good job of keeping that soil in place so it's not eroding. Whoops. And then also, I'd be remiss if I didn't add this with Don here, but both pennycress, especially pennycress, but both pennycress and winter camelina do an excellent job of suppressing weeds, particularly winter annuals and early summer weeds. So that's another very important ecosystem service. But corn has been a bugger, and Samantha knows this as well. Samantha and I have worked on different seeding methods and timing to establish pennycress in a system where we have corn in either in or after corn. And so some of the rationale for this study that I'm going to be talking about, we deem it the Corn Relative Maturity Group Study, or CRM study. In our business as usual summer annual cropping system, obviously we have this long fallow period in between corn and soybean where the soil is susceptible to erosion as well as loss of nitrogen, either leaching or runoff. And of course, the idea here with all of our 4 evergreen crops is to keep that period green, keep it covered. And that's what we're trying to do here, obviously, as well. But the problem, well, one of the biggest problems with corn being taken off as grain corn, and even soybean for that matter in the upper Midwest, is they're oftentimes, especially corn, taken off too late in the fall to then come in and directly establish pennycress or any other cover crop for that matter. There just isn't enough time between taking that corn off and the soil freezing up and winter setting in. So that, that raises the question then obviously, well, why don't we, try to establish pennycress into standing standing corn? And like I said, Samantha and I have worked on this for a number of experiments, number of years, and that's been really difficult. The pictures in the upper right-hand side of the slide here, we can get good fall establishment of pennycress by interseeding, typically interseeding late during corn development, although we've looked at earlier too, even at the same time that corn is planted, and different methods of planting as well. But using, for instance, Samantha's highboy device for interseeding into corn, we've been able to do a good job of establishing pennycress and winter camelina, but they don't grow very well. They yield very low, and even the next spring, sometimes stands don't look nearly as good as they did in the fall. And a lot of that has to do with the corn residue. If you're interseeding into corn, you harvest the corn, that residue falls in the plants, it suppresses their growth, and they just don't do very well. And even after you take the corn off, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, you still have to deal with the residue to get direct stand establishment. David, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is this working for me? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. It's been an issue. One thing I found down here, I did just, because I like to try things out too, a little bit of interseeding in the corn, and it worked. And the reason why it worked is because this farmer wasn't crazy about the corn density. He was only aiming for about 180 bushels an acre. So I wonder if you've done any kind of study in an enterprise sort of way to say, well, if I plant less dense corn with less stover, can you make that work economically?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm not actually going to show any data on that, but actually in this study, we're going to see a little bit of that too, because with going with earlier corn, you tend to have less biomass as well. So there's a little less biomass there, but we've not, we have done studies, and Samantha can chime in on this too, where we've looked at, stover removal, everything from no removal up to, 100% removal of.
Yeah, well, I'm just talking about making less dense rows.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, there are those.
Yeah,
Oh,
and so. Yeah, and so like my farmer, like I said, you have the double row cropping and that kind of thing, and you really get a lot of density. But
Mhm.
if you back off on the density, you'll also back off on the stover. But the question is can you still make money doing that?
Yeah. And that's kind of part of the rationale behind this study too. Samantha, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, not about the study, not the CRM study. I would just offer more broadly, we have looked at, the wide row, low population, high population business, just in corn and forages and things of that nature, David. And I'll tell you right now that like those populations, when you start moving those things around, you're going to take some pretty significant yield hits. And, when we're looking at, and I think this will segue nicely into what Russ has to show here, is that when we're taking those hits, we have to recover that somehow. And the best stands of pennycress we ever get are the ones where we're dealing with the drought in the corn or a drought. And we're just, and that's when the pennycress does the best, and those because there's less interference there. In addition, it works well in the sweet corn as well. So like, reducing populations to get pennycress or camelina established is, in my opinion, not a viable solution. It would be better to just not use corn and shift the entire paradigm than to ask producers to make 100 bushel per acre. But producers have different reasons for doing things that they do. But I think like what Russ has is going to kind of balance some of those losses the best we can, given the germplasm, the corn germplasms that we're using.
Yep, very good point. Very good point. So that leads very well into the rationale here with the CRM study, or corn relative maturity study. We know from prior work that we've done that really, the best time to get pennycress established for optimum growth, optimum yields, and so on is early to mid-September. And so our idea here is to look at earlier corn, try to get that off earlier, and hopefully hit that sweet spot of at least by mid-September. But we know that we're probably going to take a yield hit, right? So we got to look at the trade-offs. We go with our earlier corn, we're going to lose some corn yield. How much is that going to be? And the economics of that. But do we make that up by getting better establishment and, eventually better yields of, hopefully, anyway, getting better yields of pennycress as well. Although, as I'll show you here when I show you some data, the residue is still an issue with corn. It's just an issue. And like Samantha said, maybe it's best we change the paradigm and we don't have corn there. But anyway, so in this study, with that in mind, looking at the yield and economic trade-offs, we had 4 sites. We have 4 sites in the study. This year is our last year. After we harvest the soybean from it, we'll be done with the CRM study. But 2 sites, Morris and Rosemont from Minnesota, and then 2 southern sites, one in Illinois and one in Ohio. So for the Minnesota sites, we decided that a 95-day corn, that's pretty common out here in Midwestern Minnesota, and even places in southern Minnesota as well, as being a full season hybrid. That's pretty commonly grown by farmers. And then back off that, or go with earlier corn all the way, as you can see, down to 76-day corn. And then at the southern sites, 113-day corn is the common full season hybrid there. And then we backed off from that all the way down to 95-day corn. And then in this study, our check was silage corn, using the full season corn, but taking it off as silage, because generally speaking, that was early to mid-September at all of the sites. We're able to get that corn off for silage. And of course, we're taking almost all the residue. And we just know from previous work that we've done that we get really, if we're going to direct drill or directly establish pennycress, we get good establishment after taking corn off for silage. So that was our check in this case. So as far as harvesting the corn, then what we found is that, from at the northern sites, from 86-day corn down to 76-day, generally speaking, although obviously you can see that there's some variation in harvest dates there across all the sites. This is over 2 years of the study. But generally speaking, that 86-day corn and earlier, we're able to get that off by mid-September. And at the southern sites, the 105-day corn and down to 95-day corn, generally speaking, we're able to get that off by mid-September. So we're getting into that sweet spot, if you will, for planting pennycress. And David, did you have another question before I move on? David?
Oh,
Did you have-
no, I'm sorry.
Oh, you just.
I
had you. I'm
just
sorry.
never, there you go. Okay, sorry.
Russ,
Well-
while you're paused, I do have a question. This is Mitch. You said that the check in the study was harvesting for silage. So are these silage harvest dates or are these grain corn harvest dates? that you're
These
showing?
are grain corn. I'm sorry. These are grain corn harvest dates, but thank you for asking that, pointing that out, Mitch. Yeah, so this is just grain corn harvest. I think in all cases, the silage corn came off the first week of September. And then soon after that, we planted the pennycress. So anyway, yeah. So that, like I said, that mid-range corn on down to earlier corn at all the sites, we're able to get that off pretty much by mid-September. So in terms of corn yields, which, obviously that's really important. And can you guys see my cursor does that show up? Okay. So pretty much at all of the sites, the corn yields are really low in Ohio. You can see that. That's because the first year of the study, they had like severe drought and almost had no corn. They had really good pennycress stands. So, like Samantha said, if you don't have corn there, pennycress does pretty good. But pretty much in like the Illinois here, the 105-day corn, that mid-range corn yielded and this is averaged over 2 years, yielded pretty much as good as the full season 113-day corn. This is grain corn again. And Rosemont, as you can see, the 86-day corn, which is a mid-range corn for us up north, did pretty much as good as the 95-day corn. Morris, there was a little bit of drop in yield, and I believe it was significant, but not a great deal of loss of yield there. And so it did allow us earlier harvest of corn, earlier establishment of pennycress. It did allow us to get in, and we're directly drilling the pennycress in this case. And what that did show us, as we hypothesized, is that by getting in there earlier, and in this case, we tried to use an aggressive no-till drill at each of the sites and to help displace that residue and get better seed to soil contact. And pretty much at all the sites, I just show the Minnesota sites here, but there was a general trend in increasing plant population density, improved stands, more green cover, both in the fall and in the spring, with earlier removal of corn and earlier planting of pennycress. And generally speaking, the check did tend to have the highest population and highest green cover as well. But as you can see here at the northern sites, and I guess that's probably why I stuck this graph in, so that came off, in this case, October 8th. By the time we made our plant stand counts, we typically waited, before it, just at the time that it was starting to get really cold and the soil was starting to freeze. So we allowed as much time as possible for those plants to establish. And there was very little or nothing where we had planted after the 95-day corn. Doesn't mean that plants didn't come up. They actually did, but most of them came up the following spring. So there wasn't much for emergence in the fall, but there was in the spring. And actually, at least for the Morris site, that did show up in pennycress yields, where, even though, there was almost no emergence in the fall, we still did get emergence in the spring, and we still did get a pennycress yield. And generally speaking, Ohio site, the 2 Minnesota sites, generally speaking, the earlier we were able to establish and get the corn off and establish the pennycress, the higher was the pennycress yield. But as you can see, and this is average across both years, even the silage corn, the yields weren't necessarily stellar. This is at all of the sites we used the black seeded pennycress, Min 106 non-shatter. But Rosemont did very well. Rosemont's the standout. They got really good yields there. But as you can see, generally speaking, earlier removal of corn, earlier planting of pennycress typically led to higher yields. Another thing we didn't see, I don't show it here, but we didn't see any change in oil content across the sites. There was a little bit of a difference depending on planting date. But again, I didn't put that in here just because I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about it. But with earlier planting of pennycress, also, of course, it matures earlier. So we can get that off earlier. And then for this experiment, we're double cropping, sequentially double cropping soybean after removal of the pennycress. And this picture up here shows very well that, of course, the earlier the corn was taken out, the earlier the pennycress was planted, the better, or the sooner that could be harvested the following summer. So that, so again, that leads to earlier planting of the soybean for the sequential double crop. And the Illinois site here, they waited till they removed all their pennycress before they planted soybean. But at the other sites, Ohio, Morris, I know, Rosemont, I think, did the same too. When we removed the pennycress, we planted the soybean. And there was a trend in, better soybean yield, obviously, with earlier planting and earlier removal of pennycress. The yields were extreme. This is last year. We don't have everything. Well, we don't even have everything harvested yet, as well as analyzed for 2022. We're into our second and end of our cycle this year. And the yields, of course, were very low for the Minnesota sites last year. I think they're going to be a lot higher. Well, I know they're going to be a lot higher this year from what I've seen so far. But we had severe drought last year. I was surprised we got any yield at all, really. And yields, double crop soybean yields were very quite good at the southern sites. But again, the earlier we can get that pennycress planted, the earlier it's going to mature the following year, and the sooner we can get that harvested, and sooner we can get the soybean on. So that should help to improve soybean yields. Oh, I also point out we got I know, and I've seen this before where ducks will nest in pennycress. For some reason, they don't nest in winter camelina, but they like pennycress. So that's another ecosystem service pennycress has to offer. So yeah, just quickly in summary then for this study, harvest of the mid-range corn allowed us to get in near that mid-September sweet spot of getting pennycress planted. And it didn't really significantly reduce corn grain yield, which I think is real important finding. Earlier, the pennycress was planted. Of course, earlier was established, generally improved its fall establishment, which did, generally speaking, we had better spring. We did lose some plants over the winter, but generally spring establishment was good too, or green cover with earlier establishment. And then, of course, earlier planting of pennycress leads to earlier harvest of pennycress and earlier planting of soybean, and helps improve the double crop yields of soybean. But again, the bottom bullet point here, residue is still an issue. The thing I haven't talked about, we have another study, and Samantha can maybe chime in and talk about that if she wants, but we have another study where we're looking at using like light vertical, shallow vertical tillage to help incorporate some of that residue, and then either come in and direct drill. We've got treatments of direct drilling, and then also broadcast seeding, and that just doing that like disking, light vertical tillage helps get the pennycress established as well. Either way, I mean, broadcasting works pretty good too. And that's probably be more economical for farmers to do that, because they could maybe have a device that could do both at the same time, disking and then broadcasting seed behind it. But we get good seed to soil contact by using that method there as well. So did you want to add anything to that, Samantha?
I think the large rationale for that was because our corporate partners are looking for kind of a fast one pass, and where, you know, they're falling back to some of the original cover crop work where they would put the seed out with the combine, essentially to see when they would be harvesting, and then come in and do a light tillage. I think that was kind of the main idea why we moved in that direction. We are still dealing with a fair amount of residue in those spaces. I think the lighter tillage is better though, because we end up getting less of that high, those canyons, I guess is probably a better way to say it. But I do know that our partners in the South do want to be able to not direct seed it, based on the management around the cover cress program. And so, you know, and getting it out fast and coming in with a light vertical tillage is probably going to be the most cost-effective way, especially with some of the emergence that we're seeing, or improved emergence, or just better uniformity with the low fiber golden seed that they are working on.
Yep. So anyway, I'll
Oh, I have a question too, if I can.
oh, sure.
So you said you're using the reduced shatter stuff, and I think what you guys have is what we would call IND2. And just a word of caution, one thing about that particular line is it has a little bit of a stronger mutation that results in a little bit more resistance to shatter. And also that line in my hands is a couple days later on maturation. So you might have lost a couple days for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the big question I have is, by using that reduced shatter, did you see any difference in the seed bank issue coming back the next fall?
To be honest, we probably should have assessed that a little more closely than we did. I don't remember it. I certainly don't remember it being any worse than what we've seen in the past, and I don't think it was too bad. Come to think about it.
Okay.
What did you guys see there in Rose or Alex on the line at all? Yeah, I mean, I guess the honest answer is I don't really know, David. It seemed to me like the volunteer biz was not as bad though, at least from what I saw out in Morris.
I recall Bill Perry had mentioned, because he'd used that black line before switching over to the new golden line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I recall in the meetings when they were talking about it, they actually did I remember him saying the station wanted to murder him, I believe was the statement that he made in those large ecosystem service programs that they had with all the tile drainage work. And I also recall the PD of the project stating at the yield trials there in down in Illinois that they were not seeing under the golden seed where they were doing some of the commercial grow out, and they did not see any kind of reemergence in there that following spring. Now we didn't put out buckets or anything or pans, but those were just two things. So the black was, from what I understand, Bill Perry is on the same wanted list as me, Don, and now Russ, Gesch, and Alex Hard for destroying some fields. So yeah, but as far as the golden one, I'm not as clear. I know your question was around the IND2, but Alex, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we did observe, sort of a reseeding with the black lines where it came up and, was sprayed out midsummer and then kind of again in the fall as we did our, tried to keep our soybeans weed free after. And then in places where we have been for 2 years, we're still seeing those plants persisting, a couple of years later as we turn the fields back to the station.
Okay, and one more question about the, that particular non-shatter line. I don't know if you might have observed it or not. Did you see any of the intact pods being blown out the back?
I don't think we saw much of that.
No, I don't think we did either. And, you know, that's like, I got back there and looked just because, you know, sometimes that's like a indication that you're harvesting it a little green, but it seemed to thresh out fairly well, especially this year.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I'd
Thanks.
say if anything, you know, rather than the seed shattering on the plant, it seems like more often the pod falls off. Have you noticed that, Alex? Where they actually, the penny pod.
Not really. I mean, there were some pods on the ground that I noticed, but you know, some of the earliest maturing seed pods were sort of exploded on the plant, and you could see the seed on the ground. But you know, based on the previous line, or like the original Min 106 that a lot of this work was started with, it hangs onto the plant a lot better. And you know, we're looking at maybe just to estimate like 10% shatter instead of like 50 or all of it if we get like a good rainfall or a windstorm when it's light.
Yeah, that's all very encouraging. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? Jerry, did you have a question?
I do. I was curious about the problem with the maize stover, that problem issue with pennycress. And do you know if it's something to do with just the bulk of the material, or if it's you're seeing some kind of allelopathic effect from corn? There's two things that would be interesting. One is maize has a fairly high level of benzoxolenones, but that's usually only early in its lifetime. Usually the late stuff doesn't have much left, but it could be quite potent even in small amounts. And the other one, the phenolics in corn have a tremendous antioxidant capacity, and whether that's a suggestion that pennycress may not be happy in an environment with that kind of thing. But I mean, you notice it, but have you actually had anyone take a look to see what might be in the corn that's causing a problem, or if it's just smothered?
I tend to think it's more than smothering, and so I'm glad you brought that up, Carrie. And I think that is something that somebody really probably should take a deeper dive look at, because I've got a couple of pictures. I didn't put them in the slide presentation, even where we have the silage corn treatment, okay, where the planter went beyond into the alleyway, and the pennycress looks a lot better in the alleyway than it even looks in the silage corn. So we went out there and took soil samples and measured, you know, the main culprits, right? Nitrogen, looked at water content, soil water content, and there were no differences between the two areas. So yeah, it makes me wonder if there's something more to corn than just the smothering by the.
It'd be interesting problem for someone to look at.
Yep.
I think David could do that.
There you go. But it does it leads me to believe that there's something more than just the suppression by the biomass, you know, suppressing or snuffing out the.
Russ, there's another question on there from Carmen. Samantha addressed it a little bit in the chat, but just bringing your attention to that.
I can't see the chat, so yeah,
Oh.
if you could read the question, or.
It was really back from when we did the work with Frank and Kevin Anderson, and we did all that stover standardization work where we cut the plants up, took them down, weighed them, you know, that very insane study that seemed really easy on the whiteboard that turned out to not be very easy. And in that study, Carmen, what we found was that there was not a statistical difference between a 40 to 50% removal and 100% removal in terms of general, and that was on the early Min 106 line, in terms of spring coverage and fall establishment spring coverage. And again, it gets back, I think it shows up in the data that Russ just showed. Our Rosemont numbers were great. I think it was this year, and I think that's largely because our corn wasn't so good. And so we see that kind of when our residue tends to be a lot lower in general, and that would even include in some of the wheat systems where we actually have stover being concentrated off of the combine. We tend to see poor performance in those areas. In terms of like the allopathy aspects, we have seen what Russ has seen as well, but we haven't seen it all the time. It's kind of hard to parse because there are times when we've had beautiful stands of even the Min 106 underneath a corn canopy. But then it just gets covered up by like 4 and 5 megagrams of stover in there. A possible kind of fix would be to, we are looking at some different corn hybrids that in addition to some of the work here with the corn residue or the corn relative maturity work might provide a nice little balancing point there. So that way we can get, I think the thing is that always is missed in these lectures is that, remember, we're not just growing a cover crop, and we set those thresholds for pulling the combine out of the barn in June and July. So we need a lot, it needs to look like a crop. And I think that's one of the bigger things is, even in those residue management studies that, we're not presenting today, there was pennycress there. It's there, but the reality of it is it there at a economic threshold to be able to pull a combine out and harvest it? And even if let's just assume that each one of those pennycress plants are worth $1 million or worth a lot more than what they are, it would still be next to impossible sometimes to even harvest it because there's not enough material there to actually feed into a combine. And so that's kind of what, when we back all the way up and look at it, on average, getting a decent stand in corn, and maybe it's all these other things, is a bit more challenging than it is in some of the other systems. And I think, Russ, you coined the gold standard, and it's not really corn silage in this system. It's largely coming behind those small grains. And that's when we get our best performance out of both the pennycress and camelina in those in terms of establishment and yield on those.
This is Carmen. What moisture levels were you harvesting the corn at? What I'm thinking of is doing the economics of harvesting 28 to 30% corn and the cost of drying down versus waiting till the corn is drier in the field to give you earlier planting dates. Anything along those lines?
Yeah, the criteria that we used was 18%, I believe, is what we used across sites. So we were shooting, for 18 plus or minus 1%. So yeah, what would the economics look like if we took it off at 20 or 21, 22?
Well,
yeah.
And what I was going to say, even harvesting the corn when the stalk is a greener, you have a little more tendency to get less dry leaves on the ground because they would probably decay a little quicker being chewed up earlier, if that's a possibility of reducing the residue.
Hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
I think in terms of thinking about the overall limitations of the system, from really as we start moving away from scholarship and think more about, being more practical and thinking more clearly about the interactions with our practitioners. In the South, they're using irrigation a lot to be able, they may have more time to get into the field post their corn harvest. But in many of those situations, they're falling back on irrigation. And so the question then comes back in is, can they even afford, we're talking about giving up some yield here with our, CRM projects and moving the corn maturity group around and things of that nature, and trying to cover those costs. But when you start adding in fertility, you start adding in like the need for irrigation. I know we use a lot of irrigation here in our breeding plots as well. And so that's the bigger picture of this. We have to think like, okay, well, maybe that's just going to be its way it's going to work in the southern states and the I states. It's probably going to require maybe some kind of irrigation in those systems to ensure that they get a good set. Because the seed will just sit out there if they don't get a rain. And that's one of the issues I think that, for us, we kind of moved our dates up a bit just to be sure we got a good catch of rain before it got cold so we can get some establishment out there. So I think there's a lot of pieces as we start looking this more broadly to the economics and how this would fit across a wide range of systems. And I don't know that we fully have all that nailed down. I think we have enough information for early adopters that are interested in taking risk. And I think particularly with camelina, as Colin and others have seen, I do think that one is probably a lower risk endeavor than actually taking our where we're at with our pennycress program. I don't know how you feel about that, Russ. I hope I'm not like digging more holes for us.
No, I would agree. Yeah.
So on that note, Samantha and Russ, do you have similar studies in the pipeline with the corn relative maturity with camelina?
Yeah. Well, in fact, we've got a paper we're working on, don't we? Yeah, with camelina, winter camelina. Yeah. And you run into the same issues with winter camelina.
I guess the one difference I'm wondering about perhaps, because Russ, you published on a later planting date of camelina can make better yields. And it seems like that's maybe a difference from pennycress. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think so. And we're starting to go back, and now that we've got the yellow seeded pennycress, which has better germ than the black seeded stuff, we're going back to take a more in-depth look at planting data as well. But I think what we're going to find is, yes, pennycress planted a little bit earlier than camelina does better by planting it earlier. Whereas winter camelina, we see that a little bit later, late September, early October, as being better in terms of yield. But it's not necessarily better in terms of the double crop system, whether it's relayed or
right.
double. We want to go earlier.
And there's that trade-off with the maturity and yield.
Yeah.
That's the sweet spot. Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Depends on which side you want to make the yield up on.
Speaking of planting dates, I'm just curious if anyone has tried planting pennycress really early, like beginning of August or mid-August. And what I'm thinking about is if we were trying to complement a crop like pea, spring pea, like what we learned about from purists last week, how early can we push pennycress? I understand it doesn't flower or doesn't bolt too readily in the fall. I know that if you planted that early, you'd probably run into more summer annual weed issues, but if it would build a bigger rosette, if it would mature even faster in the spring, there could be some benefits, with the main goal being, if we were going to bridge between pea and a typical pennycress seeding, then we'd have this wide brown period in the summer, which of course we would want to avoid. So just curious if anybody's played with that and if it's something that we could, mess around with and see if there's potential there.
We've seen it. So not intentionally, in our double cropping research with Sarah Moore, in that project, we ended up getting massive shatters, just the way bad storms or whatever. And in those, we actually saw the pennycress come back, and it was with us for a while. I don't believe it made it all the way. This is a little bit earlier than what you're talking about, because this would have emerged in the spring.
Sure.
I think ultimately, though, one of the beauties of pea, one of the beauties of wheat, spring wheat, and even winter wheat as well, is that you do have that window. And I think that window of that fallow period is extremely important for us to allow our practitioners enough opportunity to not have some complicated approach to it, to be able to better time and ensure that they can get those things done. And I know it's not ideal having, coming off and having, low plant resources out there when we have losses. But, given the fact that we're asking farmers to plant, in many cases, 3 crops in 2 years, I think having any type of flexibility in there is going to be huge. And I think that's why, when we submitted the camelina cap, the large push in that was largely looking at acreage with wheat and soybean. We just didn't want to deal with any other complications in the system. And we wanted it to be a success.
Yeah, I can add too, back in the day when we first got started with our stuff, Don made us go out in August and plant the stuff. And the upshot of that, it was a challenge because for one reason, that gives you a long window of those summer weeds to come back and to compete with the emerging pennycress. And so that was a huge problem. And then the other problem the plants did grow up very robust in the spring and looked really, really good. But those were the years too that we got the most lodging.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, I think the weed issue sounds like the more challenging one with the work that you're doing on lodging resistance and dwarfing and things, we could potentially address that. But it would take some concerted work on controlling those summer annual weeds.
Are there similar studies in the pipeline for, the relative maturity soybean too? Because soybean harvested a bit sooner than corn typically. So with camelina, if you could plant a little later, optimally, like end of September, can you follow that again with soybean? I don't know how many farmers do soybean, but
A lot.
Uh,
A lot of farmers out west do it, in the Dakotas and so on. Don't
That was
recommend.
one idea. That was one of the ideas that I sent out to you for you to laugh at, right? Russ, was that system with a continuous soybean system with pennycress and camelina, and it wouldn't be a continuous soybean system. It would be a system that is still is rotation. But rotation within a year.
Right.
Don, I don't recall it that way. I recall you saying, hey, we've got this thing that shatters. Maybe it can perennialize itself and we can just have corn and soybean move around it. And we did that study. That's how I got on the wanted list with the stations, because that's what we did. And I don't believe that worked out so well. And I think Alex can comment, because we were chatting earlier about some of the results in one of the projects.
Let's don't talk about that. Let's talk about camelina in that system. Let's get away from the carryover issue, which can be solved. Let's just talk about it in the context of camelina. Could that work in a continuous soybean system is what I'm saying.
I think it could. It's one way to break that up a little bit too.
I would love to suggest that someone take a look at that, just to look at the
Ohio is. I know Alexander Lindsay, as in part of the agronomy team here, they are looking at camelina entry points. Not camelina, pennycress, it could be camelina too. We actually posted those and they would have been segues if we'd have been funded. But they are looking at, instead of entry points in wheat and small grain and, corn, like what we're doing, they're actually putting it in these oil seeds in the soybean year at leaf drop. And
I would like
because they have the flexibility. They have the flexibility in that system as they back up to, and I hope I'm not quoting him wrong, still make 200 bushel an acre with June planted corn, I think is what. So they're thinking of it is because they do so much soybean, wheat, and winter wheat and soybean double cropping and soybean double cropping in that state. They thought that could fit in there, and because they already were doing some work just with general cover crops in there anyway. I know that they're either those studies have rolled out or they're still in the kind of the docket phases at the moment. I don't know, Russ, if you've kept up with that or not.
I haven't, yeah.
We pitched, that was one of the big pitches in the CAP grant, was to, the whole question was to think beyond corn. Just, I wouldn't let anyone use corn except for Wisconsin. I let them use silage corn. And the rest of us had to think more broadly about fitting in systems that it could work. And those kind of, soy, wheat, something like that was part of that discussion. They were not just complete soy. They always were like, they had a small grain in there, particularly in Ohio. And I would imagine that could probably carry down into Kentucky and so on.
I would like to see it done here as well, in terms of looking at that system based on what you guys laid out today and the problem with corn. I would love to see those types of systems evaluated here.
So Russ, what I just heard was we need to take a napkin and write down, Don said, give us money to go do this. And then we'll submit that, and we'll make Mitch's deadline of October 30th. I'll draw a picture on there too. Or like, here we go. Is that how that's going to work, Don?
We'll make a note
I
of
would
that.
take a little more time, think it through, and submit next July 1.
Sounds good. Well, any other discussion, any other questions? And otherwise, we're pretty much right on time. We can quit right now.
We could.
So Russ, basically what you guys are saying is that everyone in the Midwest is having problems getting pennycress into the corn soybean rotation. No one has figured it out. Even with the folks that are going commercial in the southern part of the Midwest, even where they go in and they do a complete, a pretty high level of disturbance in planting pennycress, it is still, in those cases, still really difficult to get it established. Is that what I hear?
Well, Russ just showed you can do it. That's the finding of the CRM. It did work.
It did work.
Yeah, so it does work. I mean, and I think that, with a combination on the soybean side with the skip row that Russ put together, and I think with improved genetics coming out of the breeding program and out of David and Jim's programs, along with the I Prefer, it is working. Like it is. And so I think that's an important piece. It's not working the way we intended, but it is working. And I think Russ's data shows that.
What I'm asking though is the commercial scale projects in the southern part of the Midwest, what is their success rate in getting pennycress established in those commercial systems?
They would say 100%.
Or more.
Oh, they would say, that's right. They would say 150%. That's right.
Yeah.
I forgot.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I didn't give them enough credit there. We don't know. I mean,
I don't think it's any better than what we've shown that we can do, in this study.
I was asking whether there was a difference between here in Minnesota versus in terms of establishment as compared to, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana.
I don't think we've really seen it in this study, have we, Samantha? I mean,
no, but I mean, covercress is, they are looking at Missouri. That would be part of like their outer Illinois. Then Missouri would be their kind of. I mean, I don't know. They never really showed us anything. We asked. We put together a little one-page request for information. I mean,
is anyone online today from Covercrest that would like to say anything about it in terms of the success and establishment?
Don, I'm not from Covercrest, but my understanding is because they have such a longer growing season down there, they just simply easier to plant it after corn, and they get good stands and reasonable yield. So they don't have the same constraints that we have in Minnesota.
time-wise, certainly, yeah.
Yeah,
And they
that's
still
just
have the
wondering
moisture
whether-
constraints, though. They still deal with the moisture constraints. I mean,
Well, true.
I think one of the biggest telltales was one of our Southern collaborators coming back to Russ and I and saying, "Oh my God, this is not working." I'm like, "I know, it's okay. We're going to figure out a thing that does work." And so we've made some believers. I mean, it's not like we want it not to work. We do, and I think we do have some things that are working. So yeah, I think the slope is positive, and it's more positive than it has been in a long time, in my opinion. And I think the CRM project, combination with the work that we're findings in the DISC 1 and DISC 2 project, and then with our actual system project that is rolling out this year, feeling pretty confident about it. More so than usual. So yeah, I think we're making good progress.
Yeah, I think we're making some progress, definitely.
I have one more quick question on the relay cropping system with soybean. Has anyone tried different soybean planting depths? This is an idea Aaron Lorenz had, is just maybe there's some soybean out there that you can plant deeper, so that you don't have as much overlap between the cover crop and soybean, just in terms of getting it a little deeper, so you can still plant your soybean on time before you kill the cover crop, but it doesn't come up as fast.
Yeah, nobody's really experimented with that, but that is a good idea. You know, and many years ago, I used to work with coated soybean seed too, to delay the emergence, and I think that would work too. But in this, as I would show you in this series of slides, but I'm not going to because we don't have enough time. But the interesting thing with pennycress, the overlap of those two crops is less, right? And I think pennycress actually works better in that relay system than winter camelina. We saw different results. We ran the same experiment with winter camelina, where we had the different seeding dates and the different soybean maturities. And there we saw that a later maturing soybean did a lot better, just because, you know, the overlap period is long. And so the longer you've got a soybean that'll stay in the vegetative stage, the better, you know, during that, during and then coming out of that interphase, or that overlap phase. But with pennycress, the maturity is short enough that overlap is less. So if you could plant even a little bit deeper and maybe get, you know, like a half a week to 1 week, even less of that overlap, I think that could make a big difference.
What is your typical planting depth for soybean?
1.5 inches.
Yeah, well, one thing I wonder about, Russ, and that is, with camelina, the pods are much smaller and you're getting more light penetration. With the pennycress, you have the fan-like pods, and I imagine there's less light getting down into the plants. And I'm wondering if that less light is better for kind of holding the soybeans back until you get the pennycress off.
That helps too. Although in this study that I was about to show, the soybean tended to be shorter again, because even though there was a lot of shading going on, but the overlap period was shorter, you know, with the two crops. And so that helped keep the soybean shorter too, so that the height differential is better, you know, when you're harvesting.
Sure.
So you got me intrigued, and we do have 20 more minutes if you want to do a lightning version of the next set of slides.
Oh, well, I could if people want to stick around. Samantha, I don't.
You're on your own. I'm getting ready to turn into a pumpkin already, though. So I'm sure you'll be just fine, Dr. Gesch.
Okay. Well, do you want me to run through them?
I don't care. I don't. If I mean, you know, give them what they paid for.
Yeah. There you go. So, well, let's see here. So
anyway, I gotta run. Thank you all. I gotta go. Bye.
Okay, we'll see you. Thanks, Samantha. Yep. Yeah. So quickly, in this relay cropping study, we're a couple different things here. We wanted to find out what the interseeding effect is on the pennycress itself, right? You know, you're going in there, you're planting the, well, if we go back a slide, that middle slide on top, you know, we're running over plants, you know, standing pennycress to interseed that soybean. So what effect does that have on pennycress? And then in this study, we're looking at, determining, kind of the optimum time for interseeding to bump up soybean yield without, hurting the pennycress yield. And then also determine whether cultivar maturity of soybean makes any difference on the system too, as far as productivity. So quickly, the pennycress was planted, in this case, the Gold Star system. We planted after spring wheat, 9 kgs per hectare, around 8 pounds per acre. And then we use this interseeder to plant, to do the skip row planting with. The pennycress were planted on 7.5-inch rows or 19 centimeter space. And then, so you got 3 rows of pennycress, and then this 4th row is skipped, and that allows you to plant 30-inch, the dead center plant 30-inch soybean on these skip rows, or 76 centimeter. And then as far as planting dates, we looked at a late April, early May, and mid-May, which pretty much corresponded to the first seeding date was pretty much when pennycress was just transitioning to bolting. The second sowing date, it was at bolting, and by the 3rd sowing date, it had already started flowering. So it was flowering when we planted the soybean. And then looked at a standard, which for us is about a maturity group 1 soybean, and then an early soybean is 0.2, and a later soybean 1.7, which there are farmers out by us that'll occasionally grow 1.7s, and it reaches full maturity by fall, and by the time it's typical harvest date. So and then the soybean or camelina in both years of this study was harvested the 20th of June, and then of course the soybean harvested later, but that depended on maturity of the soybean. The earlier maturing soybean obviously came off earlier than the later soybean. So 2 years, the first year we didn't see the control in this case is monocrop pennycress, just solid seeded 7.5-inch rows. Compared to the pennycress where soybean had been interseeded, there was no difference. So the interseeding didn't have an effect, but yields were really low that first year. And that was because we had a real dry fall, followed by a dry spring. We didn't get very good establishment. And that was a primary reason for low plant population or lower yields. But in the second year of the study, where we had better establishment, this was min 106 before non-shatter, so just the regular min 106. So a yield of around 1,200 kgs or pounds per acre for the monocrop. That that's a pretty decent yield for us out in Morris. But as you can see, the interseeding did have an effect where yields of pennycress were lower for the 3 interseeding dates, with the second interseeding date when the plants were bolting being the least affected. But there was, again, an effect of interseeding. One thing we do see is that consistently the oil content of pennycress is higher for the relay treatments than it is for the monocrop. It's not a big difference, but it was consistent enough across both years that it was statistically significant, even though it was just 1%. And that's primarily because when those two are overlapped, their growing season overlap, soybean is still pretty small. It's not nodulating. It's not biologically fixing nitrogen. So it's competing for that nitrogen with pennycress. And the lower the nitrogen content, usually almost with any oil seed, and particularly pennycress and camelina, the higher your oil content. So that's no big surprise there, but it was pretty consistent. And here in this study, we got really good height differential between the pennycress and the soybean. This is averaged over the 2 years. And the soybean remained fairly short. There was only a 2 centimeter difference. The relayed soybean was 2 centimeters higher than the monocrop soybean in this case, but fairly consistent across sowing date. The first 2 sowing dates the soybean were a little bit taller than the third, but the height differential was really good. We're able to harvest the pennycress without damaging the soybean at all in this particular.
That's where a deeper soybean planting would be interesting to see on that situation right there, yeah.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, like you said, Matthew, I think, you know, if you had the soybean planted a little bit deeper, to get it to emerge just a little bit later, yeah, I think that could work. That it's definitely worth trying. Definitely worth trying. One thing I want to show you here in just a couple slides is that I think our plant population makes a big difference on soybean too, and that's something we need to take a closer look at. But with this is just the relay soybean here. The second sowing date yields for soybean were a little bit higher, but not different than sowing date 3, but it was significantly higher than sowing date 1. And this is where the results are a bit different compared to winter camelina. With winter camelina, we definitely saw that the later maturing soybean out yielded the common, the 1-1 soybean. And both are higher than the 0-2. That happened for both winter camelina and pennycress. But I think, and this is averaged across all sowing dates here, and there wasn't an interaction either. But when averaged across the seeding dates, I think that the reason that there isn't a difference is because you have that shorter overlap period between pennycress and soybean, whereas with winter camelina, which comes off a little bit later, there's more of a overlap between the two, and that can make a difference, I think. One thing we did find, oil and protein content weren't affected by either the relay sowing date or the relay sowing itself, or I mean relay planting itself didn't have any effect on the quality. Of course, it did differ a little bit by cultivar, and that's to be expected. The earlier soybean was different than the 1-1 and the 1-7. Interesting thing, and so here's where this plant population for the relay crop soybean, I think, is really important, because seeding date 1, overall node numbers were higher than seeding date 2 and 3. This is for the relayed soybean. Okay, this is average across all cultivars. Branches, there were more branches, there were more pods. Biomass was higher, although it was not statistically significant. But, you know, as you remember, sowing date 1, the soybean yield was lower. And I think the main reason it was lower is because the population was lower. So the longer that overlap period, the more likely, and this is average across both years, the more likely you are to lose some soybean. So maybe by bumping that seeding rate up, we might be able to make that up, and maybe even, you know, help improve yields even more. Like I said, that's something we haven't taken a good look at, but we really need to. The other thing I wanted to point out, so this is the relayed soybean compared to monocrop. In this case, what we're calling a conventional practice, which is the 1-1 soybean sown at that sowing date 2, the first week of May. Obviously, grain yield was higher. Now, this is averaged across all 3 cultivars, the early, mid, and late. And grain yields were higher for the monocrop conventional practice. But it differed, the yield penalty, of course, differed with seeding date and maturity group of soybean. The highest was for the early soybean sown the earliest at sowing date 1, and that was a 38% yield loss or yield penalty. But it was only 10% for the second sowing date, the later maturity group soybean. And average across both years, it wasn't found to be different, significantly different than the conventional practice treatment. Going back to yield components, node numbers were higher compared to relayed soybean, but that's because for the relay soybean, like I said, the 0-2 is averaged in with the 1-1 and the 1-7. If you take, and even the monocrop early soybean has fewer nodes than the maturity group 1-1 and 1-7. So if you pull that out of this and just look at the 1-1 and the 1-7, the node numbers were not different. Branch numbers were not different. Pod numbers were not different. Biomass, hugely different. So what's happening here, we didn't unfortunately actually measure it, but you know, we've seen it in many other studies where the seeds tend to be smaller. You get those smaller soybean seed, and fewer per pod with the relay soybean than the monocrop soybean. So that's primarily where we're seeing the yield hit there. And that's kind of fed into what Lucas Roberts, and he'll be talking about this later, I'm sure, PhD student with Aaron Lorenz. And within the I-Prefer study, they're looking at a whole battery of different soybean varieties to look at which have better genetics for this particular system. And it does turn out there's at least one or two where, you know, the relay crop yields aren't any different than the monocrop. So they're able to handle that competitive effect, you know, when the two crops are overlapping better than other soybean cultivars. And like I said, you'll be talking more about that later, I'm sure. One of the forever green. So that's about it. You know, relay interseeding did, at least 1 out of the 2 years, did have an effect on pennycress. The 1117, obviously they yielded higher than the earlier in the relay system. And looking at individual treatments, that later maturing soybean at the sowing date, second sowing date, did the best, and was at least 90% of the monocrop yield. And again, relay cropping didn't affect seed quality, which that's really important. And then one of the things I want to revisit is the planting geometry. Look more at row spacing, not just for soybean either, but for pennycress too. And then seeding density to see what effect that may. Well, that's it.
Thanks very much, Russ. Thanks for the great update and highlighting what we've learned and the issues that we still have to deal with. And it's still the same old ones, right? But just showing that we made some progress and trying to think those things through. And this last piece in terms of breeding soybeans to fit the system, I think is also obviously very, very exciting as part of the effort. Breeding for soybeans are able to tolerate that shade, and so it's a whole series of great research opportunities coming along that I hope will, in the long run, provide some real solutions. But that establishment issue in corn still haunts us, and
yep, that still haunts us. But like we talked about, like Samantha said too, I mean, we've made improvements over where we were.
That's what I mean, but it's but we have to get to the point where the risk isn't there. I mean, as we go commercial, it's, as we know, if we can show failure in our research plots, we know we can show it in the conventional field.
Yep. So one other update I forgot to mention, Don, is that there's a holdup right now through the federal government in going commercial with pennycress, at least for the covercress folks, because of changing more than one gene with CRISPR-Cas9.
That's what I heard too. Yeah.
So that's going to set us back a little bit anyway.
Well, except for the material coming out of the University of Minnesota.
Well, yeah. Yep, that's true. So, yep.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about that later, but I mean, that was part of our judgment a number of years ago to move in the direction that we did, and David could talk more about that.
The big thing was I was just too lazy to dig out the CRISPR stuff.
But it was a good call.
I mean, I know how to do it. I've been cloning since I was 1980. So it's I was just too lazy.
Well, that's one way of saying it, but I think it was a little better judgment than that.
I had a question.
Question here.
Oh yeah.
Beginning, the slide talking about nitrate reduction, and talking about all the various trade-offs that there are. Is there a number at this point of what you would need to pay a farmer for capture and having, I forget what the numbers were, but they were dramatic, this much less nitrogen going into the groundwater?
Right. Right. I'd say that's a great question. I don't have an answer to it, but
Somebody has.
right. But that is something I think we need to do. Something that, yeah, there should be some type of compensation. Is there any talk of that policy wise that you know of, Don?
Well, you know, it's been discussed in policy for, you know, many, many years, but the point comes down to who pays it, right?
Yeah, well, true.
What does that system look like, right? And how do you measure it to make sure that it's truly happening and all of those things? But, you know, Colin is doing a lot of that work in terms of camelina establishment and basically giving an environmental payment. And so, you know, based on what we know about these systems, that if you have that system in place, it's established, you would get an environmental payment for that type of service. But in terms of developing a program that does that, you know, that's the work that is being supported by Clean Water Council, that is looking at that type of model as a pilot study. So we'll have a little more idea as to whether there's long-term interest in that type of payment as we move forward here in Minnesota and policy.
The other thing I'd add is just, you know, the water quality trading world is where that would really fit well, and there's not much of a footprint in that world anymore that's real. There have been some pilot programs in different places. But I think that one of the many carbon payment programs out there, I think it's from Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, I believe is what it's called, and it's a spin-off from Iowa Soy, pretty sure. They are paying for carbon and water quality outcomes at the same time. So that would be an avenue, you know, for whatever geography they cover, and I don't remember how broad it is, they might be interested in paying for some of those nitrate reductions. But I don't know if that's been explored or how you get into their program or anything like that. Probably they have a round number for a cover crop, and we might be able to just access that payment just as a cover crop versus specifically for one of these oil seeds.
Well, Russ, again, thanks for putting a few slides and making us stay here for an hour and a half. We appreciate it very much.
Yep. Not a problem. You're more than welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
I have one last thought, which is always never a good one for me. And that is just simply now we've been doing this for a while. And we look at our weather patterns for the fall. And like, for instance, we put out the stuff from time to time and the rain doesn't come. And of course, there's no crop for the farmer. And the question I have is, do we have enough information there to start getting insurance for that kind of thing?
Well, that's a possibility, but you know, just in thinking about the falls in Minnesota, and just, you know, I've been here about 50 years, and you know, there's a trend, I think, for drier and drier falls, right? There was a period when I first arrived in Minnesota, the falls were really pretty wet. Difficulty getting the crops out in the fall, but there's, I have to look at the data set, but there's, in my mind and thinking about it, there's been a trend for drier and drier falls, I think, here in Minnesota. So that would have to be something that could be modeled, right? To get an idea of the rainfall patterns that have developed and predicting whether or not what's the probability of failure of getting, you know, these crops established in the fall in various regions of the Midwest. Yeah. But before you start talking about insurance, people aren't going to provide the insurance unless they know the risk that they're insuring, right? So there would have to be some pretty good extensive background work done to try to make those predictions. So Very good, everybody.
Yeah, thanks
All right.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
See y'all
All right.
later.
Russ.
All right, bye-bye.